David Wilson stood on his balcony and enjoyed the crisp autumn breeze in the morning. He looked at the morning sky and spotted a few stars. He kept looking at the sky and closed his eyes in pain. David hated where his life had brought him. A few years ago, he was living his best life and enjoyed every happiness in life. However, everything had changed for him. He no longer wished to be alive or want anything in his life. He had confined himself to his company and his home. David used to be a party animal. He loved hanging out with his friends and arranged many parties for them. But that unfortunate incident in his life had changed everything for him and made his life meaningless. Linda was running late for her interview. She was called by the head housekeeper of Wilson House. She left her home and caught the bus. She kept looking at her watch and prayed to reach on time. 15 minutes later, Linda was dropped off by the bus in a posh area. She was astonished by the grandeur of the affluent neighborhood. She stood for a few minutes and enjoyed seeing the beautiful mansions with well-kept gardens. She started walking to Mr. Wilson's mansion and was surprised to see a vast mansion with an elegant design and lush trees at the entrance. A security guard asked Linda about her purpose for coming to the mansion. Linda was a bit nervous. She told the guard that she had been called by Ms. Mary for the interview. The guard picked up his walkie-talkie and asked Ms. Mary for confirmation. The security guard opened the door and signaled another guard to take Linda to Ms. Mary. As she walked behind the guard, she noticed plenty of servants in neat and crisp uniforms. She saw a young maid picking up the tea tray from the garden table. A gardener was working in the garden. Linda instantly felt conscious of her wrinkled and cheap clothes. She took her big handbag to hide her unironed shirt. A few minutes later, she was taken behind the mansion. The guard instructed her to walk inside the annex, where Ms. Mary was waiting for her. As Linda walked inside, she saw a middle-aged woman gracefully sitting and reviewing the resume of candidates. Linda walked to her and smiled at her. Mary introduced herself to Linda and conducted her interview. Linda shared her prior experience working with several prestigious families in the city. Mary was impressed with Linda's resume, and she hired her. Linda was over the moon to get the job. Her pay was 3 times better than her last job. Linda walked out of the room towards the gate. As she came near the entrance, she saw the guard open the gate, and 3 cars came in. The first and third cars had armed guards to protect the second car. A few minutes later, a driver stepped out of the car and opened the car's door. Linda saw a young and handsome man stepping out of the car. He was dressed in an expensive black suit with a silver wristwatch. The man had stern eyes, tight jaws, and tattoos on his neck and wrist. Linda asked the maid who the man was. She told her that it was David Wilson, the mansion's owner. Linda nodded and averted her gaze back to David. She thought David might be a gangster because of his appearance and the number of security guards surrounding him. She decided never to anger her boss, or else she would have to pay heavy consequences. The next day, she arrived early as Mary had instructed her. Mary explained the rules and regulations and told her to be precise about the taste and presentation of the food. She further instructed her that David likes his meals on time. Linda noted down everything and proceeded to the kitchen to prepare the meals. She cooked everything with great attention to please his employer. David liked her cooking, but never said anything to Linda. A month passed, and Linda noticed that David never talked much at the dining table. He dined alone at 9 p.m. and retired to his room. The strange thing was that nobody was allowed to go to his room after 9, nor did he receive any calls or meet someone. Linda always found it strange. She always thought David could live a wonderful life and splurge his money however he wanted, but he stayed in the house and never set foot outside. She had doubts that maybe David was a gangster, so he didn't leave the house at night for security reasons. She decided to ask Mary more about David. The next day, Linda asked Mary, "Mary, why is Mr. Wilson always so quiet? Why doesn't he enjoy and go out? Or have friends over?" Mary looked at Linda and stayed quiet for a few minutes. She replied, "Meet me at lunchtime, and we will talk." Linda nodded and got busy preparing lunch. Mary and Linda had become good friends. They talked about their families and their lives, and discussed politics at lunchtime or tea in the evening. Linda knew that Mary liked chocolate chip cookies with sweet tea. Hence, she prepared it and waited for Mary to join her in the garden. A few minutes later, Mary came and took her seat. She was happy to see her favorite snack and thanked Linda. They chatted for a while, and then Linda asked her a few questions to satiate her curiosity. Why is Mr. Wilson always so serious? I have never seen him smile or socialize with anyone. Mary nodded and replied, Poor David wasn't always like this. He was such a joyful soul who spread smiles wherever he went. Mary had told Linda that she had worked as a maid and housekeeper for the Wilson family when David was a baby. She had worked for David's parents, and now David trusted her enough to delegate the responsibility of managing the house and servants. She began telling Linda why David had changed so much. David was a happy and social person who loved traveling and meeting new people. He was also enthusiastic about expanding his father's company. David was never boastful or arrogant about his wealth. Instead, he was extremely kind and helped needy people with his money. One day, he met a beautiful woman, Andrea, and she started going out with him. Andrea ran an animal shelter for injured animals. She had a kind heart and loved animals. David was moved by Andrea's kindness and compassion towards poor animals. They soon hit it off and realized they were perfect for each other. David proposed to Andrea, and she agreed. They both swore to spend their lives together. David was crazy about his wife, Andrea. He thanked the Lord every day for blessing him with a beautiful and caring wife. David and Andrea traveled the world together, embarked on different adventures, and were there for each other every time. The couple spent most dreamy 3 years of their marriage and decided to plan a baby. However, a few months later, Andrea coughed blood and didn't pay much attention to it. She dismissed it and didn't tell her husband. The coughing grew worse, and David decided to take her to the best doctors in the country. The doctor ran a few tests and diagnosed Andrea with lung cancer. At first, David couldn't believe his ears. He thought that he must have misheard the doctor, but Andrea told him to stay strong. The doctor also told the couple that Andrea's cancer had metastasized and she didn't have much time to live. David did not give up. He took Andrea to highly qualified doctors across the country who all had the same diagnosis. Tired of seeing her husband running after doctors, Andrea decided to take matters into her own hands. David, I have a few months in my hands. I want to spend it in our beautiful house and in your arms. I don't want to die in a hospital bed. Please take me home with you, Andrea requested, and David agreed. David had stopped going to the office and entirely devoted himself to caring for his wife and easing her pain. He fed Andrea, took her for a walk in the garden, read her favorite books, arranged a movie night, and talked to her for endless hours. At night, David would bury his head in Andrea's lap and cry about how she will no longer be with him. Andrea took off her engagement ring and wedding band one night and gave them to David. She touched her husband's face and said, David, marrying you was one of the best decisions of my life. These 4 years we spent together were the best years of my life, and I would do anything in my power to relive all those special moments with you again. But the Lord has other plans for us. David was crying inconsolably. Andrea also wiped her tears and continued, David, my love, I want you to keep these rings and give them to the woman who comes into your life after me. Promise that you will love someone again and move on with your life. Nothing will make me happier than to see you enjoying your life with a woman who loves you. Andrea made David promise. That night, Andrea slept peacefully with a smile on her face. When David brought her breakfast tray and woke her up, she didn't open her eyes. David dropped the breakfast tray and hugged his wife. He cried like a baby, and a few servants separated him from Andrea's body. David had forgotten how to smile from the day of Andrea's death. He stopped doing things that he loved. He was just breathing to survive, but he had no will to look forward to the future. Linda had tears in his eyes after Mary told her the story. She felt upset for thinking of David as a gangster. I hope that David soon finds love again and continues with his life, Linda said. Mary nodded and said, Amen. I hope to see my David laughing and enjoying his life again. Days continued passing, and Linda always prayed for his boss to overcome the pain of his wife's demise. Soon the holiday season came, and Linda wanted to visit her brother, who lived in another city. She talked to Mary, who told her that she needed to send a substitute in her absence. Linda agreed to send her daughter Susan in her absence. Susan was an excellent cook, but unlike her mom, she didn't want to pursue a career as a chef. She loved nature and could spend hours in a garden caring for plants and flowers. Susan was a student at a medical college. She aimed to use her expertise to save people's lives and end their suffering. She volunteered at church, orphanage, and an animal shelter in her free time. Susan wanted her mother to visit her uncle. Thus, she agreed to work as a chef for a few days in the Wilson mansion. The next day, David woke up early to reach the office. It was the last day of work before the holidays started. He was looking forward to having his sister and his nephew at home. He got ready and felt cold because of the dropping temperature. He went to his balcony to close the door, but saw a lovely young woman sitting on the garden bench without a sweater. He quickly got down to ask the woman to go inside or she would catch a cold. As he came near the bench, he looked at the woman's brown hair. It reminded him of Andrea's hair. He saw the woman get up from the bench and face him. David was at a loss for words when he saw her. She had the exact green eyes as his late wife, Andrea. He stood there speechless and saw the woman and a crippled brown puppy in her hand. She had wrapped the puppy in her sweater. "Who are you?" David asked. The woman hesitated. I'm Susan, Linda's daughter. I'll work here as a chef while she's away," Susan replied. David kept looking at the puppy. Susan cleared her throat and replied, "I found this puppy on the road. Someone had hit him, and he fractured his leg. I brought him with me to bandage his leg and take him to a vet." David was once again reminded of Andrea and her love for animals. "Get in the car. I'll take you to the vet," David heard himself saying. Susan was surprised and a bit nervous about going with a stranger, but had to save the puppy. David and Susan went to the vet. There was complete silence in the car, with only the puppy's whimpering. Susan patted the puppy and kissed him occasionally. David stayed silent throughout the way. The vet treated the puppy and discharged him. "I know an animal shelter where you can keep him," David suggested. Susan shook her head and replied, "I'll keep him with me." David brought her back to the mansion. She thanked him and asked his name. David introduced himself, and Susan was shocked that her boss offered her a ride to the vet. She went to the kitchen to meet Ms. Mary. Throughout the day, Susan kept thinking about David and his kindness towards an animal. A few minutes later, a maid came with a soft sweater and gave it to Susan. "Mr. Wilson has sent it for you." Susan was further moved by his kindness and wished to spend more time with him. She quickly wore the sweater to keep herself warm. "Dear, who gave you this sweater?" Mary asked Susan. She told her that David had sent it. This sweater belonged to David's wife. "He hasn't touched her things in years, until today," Mary said happily. Susan knew about Andrea from her mother. She touched the sweater and said a little prayer for Andrea. Susan prepared numerous dishes for David's sister and nephew, who came to spend their Christmas holidays with David. She arranged the food trolley and went to the dining room. David was already seated there. He looked at Susan and smiled gently. Susan nodded politely and instructed the maids to arrange the table. David's 5-year-old nephew, Sam, picked up fried chicken and enjoyed it. "Did you make this?" "It's delicious," Sam asked Susan. She smiled and nodded. Sam looked at David and asked, "Uncle, can she sit with us? I really like her." Susan shook her head, but Sam insisted she had dinner with them. David's sister, Jamie, also smiled and asked her to sit. Susan looked nervously at David, who nodded and smiled at her. "Ms. Susan, you should open a restaurant. My uncle and I will come to eat this fried chicken," Sam said innocently. Susan laughed and said, "That's very nice of you, Sam. But first, I want to open a hospital where I can treat patients." David was looking at Susan intently. He didn't know that Susan was doing her MBBS. Jamie smiled and said, "That's lovely, Susan. I am surprised how a medical student can cook such amazing food." Susan smiled and talked more with Sam and Jamie. Once the dinner was over, Sam insisted Susan play with him in the garden. She agreed and went with Sam. David kept staring at her, and his sister noticed. "I like Susan. She reminds me of Andrea in so many ways," Jamie said. David said nothing. He had noticed the same thing. Jamie and David went to the garden to stroll and saw Susan playing like a small kid with Sam. She laughed and chased Sam to hug him. David smiled at how good she was with the kids. He went into the garden and decided to play with them. "Hey, Sam, mind if I join you and your friend?" David asked playfully. Sam shouted in excitement, and together they played with a ball. Jamie was happy to see her brother laugh tonight. David hadn't laughed this much since Andrea's death, but playing with Susan and Sam had indeed warmed his heart tonight. "Susan, can you make me hot chocolate?" The weather is quite chilly, Sam requested. Susan nodded and asked David and Jamie if they'd like something. She returned after a few minutes and saw David sitting alone in the garden. Susan looked at him and asked, "Where's Sam, Mr. Wilson?" "Please call me David." Sam slept in Jamie's lap, so she went upstairs to her room. He smiled and signaled Susan to sit. Susan gave the hot cup of chocolate milk to David. "Thank you for the sweater." Susan gave a bag to him. David smiled and shook his head. "You can keep it. Andrea will be happy if you use it. It was her favorite sweater." Susan also smiled and said, "You are a wonderful person, David. You are kind and sweet and always care about your loved ones. I really hope that you find your lost happiness and enjoy every moment of your life." David looked into her eyes and remembered that he had promised Andrea to love again. He took a deep breath and turned towards Susan. "I had a lovely time today after so many years. Thank you for being so nice to me and my nephew Sam. I really hope that you fulfill your dream of opening a hospital." Susan looked at David lovingly and smiled. They looked into each other's eyes for a moment. David could feel an underlying attraction towards Susan, but it felt foolish to fall for a girl he had just met. Susan also thought it was impossible to have a relationship with David because they had a vast difference in their status. David cleared his throat. "Susan, I like spending time with you. Would it be okay if we go out to spend some time?" he asked nervously. Susan smiled and nodded. "I'd love to, David." She smiled and went to her room. David went to his room and opened his drawer. He took out a small box where he had safely kept Andrea's rings. He picked up Andrea's engagement ring and kissed its diamond. He smiled and looked at the sky from his balcony. "I am ready to move on, my love, but I promise you, you will be irreplaceable. I hope you are happy for me, and one day we will reunite in heaven to stay together for an eternity." David smiled at the sky and knew in his heart that Andrea was happy for him.